The night began with golden lights shining across the grand dining hall of the CEO's mansion, and everyone who entered could feel the heavy silence that rested behind the fancy decorations. The daughter Emily walked in with her fiancé Jake, a tall man with calm eyes, his presence strong but quiet. And even though he had faced dangerous missions as a Navy SEAL, tonight he felt a different kind of pressure because he knew her father was waiting at the head of the table. Emily tried to hide her nervous hands as she held onto Jake's arm. Her father was a powerful man, the head of a company that everyone in the city respected and feared. He was used to people bowing down to him, and tonight he had called this dinner not to celebrate his daughter but to test her, to question her, and to challenge the man she loved. When Emily and Jake reached the table, the CEO raised his eyes, sharp like cold steel. He did not smile. He only nodded once, his voice deep as he welcomed his daughter but ignored Jake completely. Guests were already seated, distant relatives, business partners, and a few family friends, and they all sensed the tension in the air. Whispers moved through the room like a quiet storm, everyone waiting for the moment the powerful man would speak his mind. Emily's heart pounded as she sat down. Jake pulled out her chair with gentle respect, his calm manners noticed by some of the guests who raised their brows in surprise. They could not understand why such a strong soldier would remain so soft and steady in front of a man like the CEO. And yet Jake's calmness was exactly what Emily needed, because her father's glare was already cutting into her like a sharp knife. The dinner began with servants bringing fine food, silver trays, and crystal glasses. But no one enjoyed the taste, because the real reason for the gathering was not the meal, it was the battle of pride. The CEO leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Emily, and he asked her why she continued with her small art projects when she could join his company and carry his name into greater power. His words were heavy, and his tone carried hidden anger, and everyone felt the room grow colder. Emily swallowed hard. She tried to answer, her voice soft yet steady. She told him she wanted to live her own life, to follow her passion, to create beauty through her art. She believed happiness was more important than money, and freedom more precious than titles. But before she could finish, her father's hand slammed against the table. The sound echoed through the grand hall, and every guest froze in shock. The plates rattled, the glasses trembled, and Emily's heart nearly stopped. The CEO's face burned red as he raised his voice, calling his daughter foolish, ungrateful, and blind. He accused her of wasting her future, of bringing shame to his name. And then his words turned sharper. He pointed at Jake, his finger stiff and accusing, and he said that his daughter had chosen a man who was nothing more than a soldier. A man who carried no wealth, no company, no empire, only scars from battles that had nothing to do with this family's legacy. The insult hung in the air, heavy like a storm cloud. Emily's eyes filled with tears, her lips trembled as the shame pressed down on her like a crushing weight. She had never heard her father speak so cruelly in public. The guests looked away, some uncomfortable, others pretending not to hear. But no one dared to speak because the CEO's power was too strong, his influence too wide, and his anger too dangerous to challenge. Jake sat in silence, his calm face hiding the storm that brewed inside his chest. He had faced enemy fire. He had seen comrades fall. He had survived nights in deserts and jungles. Yet never had he felt such a sting as watching the woman he loved being torn apart by her own father's words. Still, he did not speak, not yet, because he knew the time had not come. and patience was sometimes the strongest weapon of all. Emily lowered her head, her shoulders shaking, and in that moment she wanted to disappear. The sparkle in her eyes dimmed, and her hands clutched the edge of the table as if holding on to the last piece of strength she had left. The room was silent again, only the heavy breathing of the CEO filling the air, and all eyes shifted between him and the young couple, waiting, wondering, and fearing what would happen next. The CEO leaned back in his chair, his voice colder than before, and he declared that Emily had disappointed him, that she was no longer the daughter he could respect, and that by choosing Jake she had chosen a life beneath her birthright. His words struck harder than any blow, and Emily could no longer hold her tears. She rose from her seat, her face pale, her eyes wet, and she turned away, leaving the hall as her sobs broke the silence, and still Jake remained seated. His steady gaze locked on the powerful man who thought he had won the night. But little did anyone know, this was only the beginning of a battle that would shock everyone who had witnessed it. The night air outside the mansion was cool, but Emily felt none of its comfort as she rushed into the garden, her tears streaming down her cheeks, her heart aching from the cruel words that had just been spoken. She leaned against the marble fountain, her breath breaking in uneven gasps. The laughter and music from inside no longer sounded like joy. Instead, it felt like a cruel echo of her father's power, and all she wanted was to disappear into the darkness where no one could see her pain. Jake followed her quietly, his footsteps steady and calm, his face strong yet filled with concern. He reached out and touched her shoulder gently, his voice soft, telling her she was not alone, that her father's anger did not define her worth, and that she had more strength than she believed. Emily shook her head, her tears falling faster. She whispered that she felt like a failure, that she could never be the daughter her father wanted, and that she feared losing Jake because of the shame placed upon her. Jake looked at her with unwavering eyes, the same eyes that had once stared down danger on foreign soil, and he spoke with the honesty of a man who had nothing to prove. He told her that he chose her not for her father's wealth, not for her family's name, but for her heart, her kindness, and her courage. He reminded her of the nights she stayed up waiting for him when he was away, the letters she wrote to keep him alive in spirit, and the way she never gave up on him even when the world tried to break him. His words wrapped around her like a shield, protecting her from the storm of shame. Inside the hall, the guests still whispered, their voices a mix of gossip and shock. Some pitied Emily, others judged her, and a few dared to wonder if the proud CEO had gone too far. The man himself sat tall in his chair, his pride unshaken, his lips curling into a cold smile. He believed his lesson had been taught, that his daughter would break and her fiancé would walk away. He had no idea that Jake was not a man who ran from battles. He was a man who faced them head on. And tonight, he was ready for a battle unlike any he had seen before. Emily clung to Jake's hand, her voice trembling as she asked him why he stayed silent when her father insulted him, why he did not rise in anger like most men would. Jake answered with calm strength, saying that silence was sometimes louder than shouting, that patience was sharper than rage, and that the right moment always comes if one is willing to wait. He told her that her father had power in money, in titles, in fear, but not in truth, and truth was what he carried. The kind of truth that could shake the pride of any man, even a powerful CEO. Emily looked at him with wide eyes, her tears slowing, her breathing steadying. She could feel the courage in his words, like a flame sparking inside her heart. For the first time that night, she felt less afraid. She realized that her father's voice was not the only voice that mattered, that Jake's steady belief in her was stronger than all the insults thrown across the table. She nodded slowly, and Jake squeezed her hand gently, promising that he would not let this night break her spirit. Instead, it would reveal the strength she had always carried. As they stood in the garden, a servant appeared, his face pale. He whispered that the guests were restless, that the CEO was growing impatient, and that the evening was far from over. Jake gave Emily a small nod, his calm expression telling her that it was time to return, not to hide, but to stand tall. Emily hesitated, fear still heavy in her chest. But Jake's steady presence beside her gave her the courage to take the first step back toward the hall. When they entered again, the grand room fell silent. All eyes turned toward them. Emily's face still carried traces of tears, but her back was straighter, her chin lifted higher. And beside her Jake walked with quiet strength, his every step echoing a promise of resolve. The CEO narrowed his eyes, surprised to see his daughter return instead of hiding away. His smirk faded just a little as Jake calmly guided Emily back to her seat. The air grew tense once more, the kind of silence that came before a storm. Guests leaned forward, sensing that something was about to happen. The CEO opened his mouth, ready to speak again, ready to remind everyone of his power. But before his words could cut the air, Jake raised his hand slightly, not in anger, but in a calm and controlled manner, and with a voice steady as iron he began to speak, his first words carrying such weight that even the proud CEO leaned back in his chair. Caught off guard by the strength he had not expected. Jake's voice was not loud, but it carried through the hall like a bell, clear and sharp. He spoke not of money, not of titles, but of loyalty, of courage, and of love. He spoke of how Emily had stood by him in moments when life itself seemed to fade, how her heart was stronger than gold, and how her kindness carried more value than any empire. His words struck the guests deeply, pulling at emotions they had hidden behind polite masks. And one by one their eyes turned not to the CEO, but to Emily, the daughter he had tried to shame, now standing taller than he ever imagined. And in that moment, the room no longer belonged to the CEO. It belonged to the couple who stood together, bound not by power, but by love and truth. And everyone knew the night was far from finished. For Jake had only just begun to reveal the strength that would soon shock them all. The grand hall was silent as Jake stood tall, his calm eyes locked on the powerful CEO who had just humiliated his daughter. The weight of the moment pressed on everyone. The clinking of glasses and the soft rustle of clothing stopped. Every guest waited, wondering if the quiet soldier would finally speak. And when his voice came, it was steady, calm, and yet sharp enough to cut through the thick tension that filled the room. He began by telling them a story, not about money, not about business, but about survival. He spoke of a mission far away, in a land where the sun burned and the nights were long and cold. His team had been trapped with no safe way out, surrounded by danger, cut off from hope. And in that dark moment, what saved them was not wealth or power, but loyalty and trust. He explained how each man depended on the other, how courage and faith became the only shield against despair, and how in the end they survived not because of strength alone, but because of the bond they shared. The guests leaned closer, their eyes wide, their hearts caught in the rhythm of his words. Even those who had doubted him felt the pull of his story. And Emily watched him with tears in her eyes, her shame slowly turning into pride. Her father, however, sat rigid in his chair, his lips pressed tight, his eyes burning with irritation. He did not like that the attention had shifted away from him. He did not like that this man he had called unworthy now held the room with nothing but his voice. Jake turned and looked at Emily, his gaze soft, and he told everyone that the courage he had spoken of was alive in her. He said that she had more bravery in her heart than anyone could see, that when he returned broken from the battlefield it was her who gave him strength, her who held him steady when nightmares haunted him, her who believed in him when even he could not believe in himself. His voice carried no anger, no bitterness, only truth, and that truth struck deeper than any insult could. The CEO shifted uncomfortably, his pride cracking ever so slightly, because he could see the guests listening, nodding, even wiping their eyes, his control over the room slipping like sand through his fingers. Yet he tried to regain his power. He raised his hand and laughed, mocking the story, saying that battles in the desert were not the same as battles in the boardroom, that loyalty and courage were nothing compared to strategy and wealth. His words rang hollow, and for the first time, his voice did not command the respect it once had. Jake did not waver. He stepped closer, his calm presence filling the space. He spoke again, telling the CEO that true strength was not measured by money, not by titles, not by the fear a man created in others, but by the way he treated those who loved him. He said that a man who could not respect his daughter did not truly know what it meant to lead. His voice grew firmer, his words carrying the weight of a challenge, not shouted, but spoken with the kind of certainty that made everyone listen. Emily's hands trembled as she watched, but her heart swelled with a mix of fear and admiration. She had always known Jake was strong, but seeing him stand before her father, calm yet unshakable, made her realize just how deep his courage went. The guests murmured softly, some daring to nod, others exchanging glances that revealed their shock, because no one had ever spoken to the CEO this way, not in private and certainly not in public. The CEO's face reddened, his jaw tightening. He leaned forward and demanded to know who Jake thought he was, what right he had to speak in his house in front of his guests to challenge him. His voice thundered, but beneath the thunder there was a hint of uncertainty, a crack in the wall of pride he had built around himself. Jake did not flinch. He stood his ground, his voice quiet yet stronger than the storm. He said he was a man who loved Emily, a man who would never leave her side, a man who did not fear the judgment of those blinded by pride, and a man who valued her heart above any empire. The hall grew colder, the tension rising like a tide. Everyone could sense that something greater was about to unfold. Emily placed her hand on her chest, her breath catching. She felt the shift in the air, the realization that her fiancé was not just defending her. He was challenging the very foundation of her father's pride. The guests held their breath, their eyes fixed on the two men, one sitting high on the chair of power, the other standing with nothing but truth and love as his shield. Jake leaned slightly forward, his words slow and deliberate, and he told the CEO that tonight would not break Emily, that she was stronger than he imagined, that the shame he had tried to place on her was nothing compared to the light she carried, and that one day he would regret every cruel word spoken. His voice did not shake, his eyes did not wander, and his presence filled the hall with a force that no money could buy. The CEO sat frozen, his mouth half open, his power slipping, and though he tried to laugh again, it came out weak and forced. The guests were no longer looking at him, they were looking at Jake and Emily. And in that moment, everyone knew the night had turned. The soldier who was meant to be silent had become the voice of truth. And the proud father who once commanded fear now faced something he could not control. The silence in the hall grew heavier as Jake's words settled over the guests. Their eyes shifted from the proud CEO to the calm soldier who now stood like a mountain in the middle of the storm. Emily's hands trembled slightly. Her heart raced, but her eyes glowed with something new. A spark of pride, because she had never seen anyone stand so boldly for her, not even in her wildest dreams. Her father leaned back in his chair, his chest rising and falling with anger. His jaw clenched as he tried to reclaim the control he felt slipping from his hands. Jake looked around the table, his voice steady as he began to reveal truths that no one in that room had ever heard. He spoke of Emily's sacrifices, of nights when she stayed awake to write letters that kept him alive in spirit, of mornings when she carried her pain quietly so her family would not see her tears. He told them how she had worked behind the scenes, donating her time and energy to charities, feeding children, helping widows, supporting soldiers who had returned broken from war. And yet she never asked for praise, never asked for recognition, because her heart was pure, stronger than gold, and brighter than the wealth her father valued. Gasps moved through the room. Guests exchanged glances, some whispering in disbelief, others nodding as though they had suspected Emily carried more kindness than her father ever admitted. The CEO's face tightened, his pride wounded because these were things he never knew, things he never cared to ask, and now they were being spoken aloud, cutting through the image he had painted of his daughter as weak and unworthy. Jake did not stop. He spoke of the time he had returned from battle with scars not only on his body but on his soul, when shadows followed him into every night, when silence was filled with screams only he could hear, and how Emily became the light that guided him back, the anchor that kept him from drowning, the hope that pulled him toward life when despair tried to claim him. Emily's eyes filled with tears as she listened, not from shame, but from the overwhelming truth of his words. She had carried those burdens quietly, never expecting they would be revealed to the world. And yet hearing Jake speak them filled her with strength she did not know she had. The guests were silent now, no longer whispering, their eyes wet, their hearts stirred. Even the most hardened business partners felt something they could not explain, because the power of Jake's truth was undeniable. It carried weight no fortune could buy, no empire could command. The CEO shifted in his chair, his lips pressed together. He wanted to argue. He wanted to dismiss it as weakness, but he could not, because deep down he knew he had never taken the time to see his daughter, to understand her heart, to value her soul. And now that truth stood before him, undeniable, spoken by a man he had insulted. A man who carried no wealth yet carried a power greater than his own. The power of honesty, love, and loyalty. Jake stepped closer, his voice still calm, still steady. He told the CEO that respect was not earned through fear, that leadership was not measured by titles, that wealth could build walls, but it could not build love. He said that Emily carried more leadership in her kindness than her father carried in his empire, and that her courage to stand true to herself was worth more than all the gold hidden in vaults. The words struck deep, and though the CEO tried to keep his face cold, the guests could see the storm inside him, the cracks forming in the armor of pride. Emily raised her head, wiping her tears, her voice soft yet strong as she finally spoke. She told her father that she had never wanted to fight him, that she had only wanted his love and his support. But if he could not give it, she would not let it break her. She said she would stand with Jake, because Jake saw her worth even when her own father could not. The guests gasped softly, some nodding with approval, others stunned by the courage it took for Emily to speak in such a way. The CEO's hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white, his pride screaming inside him, but his voice was silent. For the first time in years, he had no words, no command, no control. The hall no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the daughter he had shamed and the man he had tried to belittle, and both of them now stood taller than his pride. Jake placed his hand gently on Emily's shoulder, his calm presence steadying her. And then he looked once more at the CEO, his words slow, each one heavy with meaning. He said that the world may remember the CEO for his empire, for his wealth, for his power, but he would remember Emily for her heart, her courage, and her love. And that was a legacy no fortune could erase. The hall filled with silence again. But this silence was different. It was not the silence of fear, but the silence of awe. The guests turned their eyes to the CEO, waiting for his response, but none came. His lips trembled slightly. His chest rose and fell. And in his eyes there was a flicker of something rare, something no one had seen before. Was it doubt? Was it shame? Or was it the beginning of change? No one could tell, but the weight of the moment was heavy. And everyone knew the night was far from over, for Jake had revealed the truth. But the greatest shock was still to come. The air in the hall was heavy with silence. Every guest leaned forward, their eyes fixed on Jake, their hearts pounding with anticipation. The CEO sat frozen, his pride shaken, his power weakened, and his face red with the weight of shame. Emily stood beside Jake, her hand trembling but her chin lifted high. For the first time in her life, she no longer felt like a shadow under her father's empire. She felt like herself, strong and seen, and everyone waited to hear what Jake would say next. Jake's voice broke the silence, calm but filled with strength. He said he did not need the approval of wealth. He did not need the blessing of pride, and he did not need the permission of a man who could not see the value of his own daughter. He said the only blessing he ever needed was Emily's love, because her love was worth more than gold, more than titles, more than the power her father had built with money. The words echoed through the hall like a bell, clear and undeniable, and the guests could not look away. The CEO gripped the arms of his chair, his jaw tight, his breathing sharp, but he could not find words to strike back. His usual fire had dimmed, his power slipping from him like water through his hands. Jake stepped closer, his calm eyes never leaving the CEO. And with each step, the weight of truth grew heavier. He told the CEO that a man who shames his daughter does not know what strength means, that a man who mocks loyalty does not know what love is. And that one day he would regret every cruel word he had spoken tonight. Emily's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were not tears of shame, they were tears of pride. She looked at Jake as though she were seeing him for the first time, not just as the man she loved, but as the man who carried her heart with honor. The guests felt the power of his words. Some of them even began to clap softly, their hands hesitant at first, but their emotions too strong to remain silent. The sound of clapping spread like a wave, until the hall filled with applause, not for the CEO, but for the couple who stood together against his pride. The CEO's face turned pale. His eyes darted across the room, searching for support, but he found none. Every gaze was fixed on Jake and Emily. Every whisper spoke of courage and truth. And in that moment, the mighty leader of an empire looked smaller than ever before. Jake placed his arm gently around Emily, steadying her. And then he spoke one last time, his voice softer now but carrying more weight than any shout could. He said that he would walk away with Emily by his side, with or without her father's blessing, because true love did not beg for approval. It created its own path, its own strength, and its own legacy. The words struck the CEO harder than any insult could. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came. The guests watched in silence, waiting for his response, but he had none. His pride was broken, his control shattered, and all he could do was sit as the couple turned toward the door. Emily held her head high, her steps steady, and Jake walked beside her with the calm strength of a man who had already won the only battle that mattered, the battle for truth and love. The hall filled with whispers once more, some guests wiping tears, others shaking their heads in disbelief. They had come expecting to see the CEO's power on display, but instead they had witnessed something far greater. They had seen a daughter rise from shame into courage, and a soldier stand against pride with nothing but honesty and love. As Emily and Jake reached the doors, the applause grew louder, stronger, until it shook the very walls of the mansion. The sound of support for the couple, drowning out the silence of the father who had lost. Emily turned once to look back, her eyes meeting her father's. There was no hatred in her gaze, only sadness and strength. She whispered softly, barely audible, that she hoped one day he would understand. Then she walked out into the night with Jake, leaving behind the echoes of applause and the weight of a father's regret. The CEO sat still, his hands trembling slightly, his eyes clouded. For the first time in years, he was no longer the man in control. He was simply a father who had lost his daughter's trust. The guests slowly rose from their seats, some leaving quietly, others gathering to speak in hushed voices about the night that would be remembered for years. The night when a soldier without wealth humbled a man of power. The night when truth shone brighter than pride. And the night when Emily chose love over fear. Jake guided her down the steps of the mansion, the cool night air washing over them like freedom. And Emily felt her heart lighter than ever, no longer chained by shame, no longer afraid of her father's shadow. Jake stopped for a moment, turning to Emily, his voice soft as he promised her that this was only the beginning, that their journey would not be easy, but it would be theirs. Emily smiled through her tears, nodding, her hand gripping his tightly. And together they walked into the future, stronger than ever, leaving behind the empire of pride and stepping into a life built on love, loyalty, and truth. And so the story ended not with the roar of the powerful CEO, but with the quiet strength of a man who loved, and the unshakable courage of a woman who chose her own path. A story that left everyone who saw it shocked, moved, and forever changed.